He claimed the cursed widow for $5 at the auction, but the town never forgot what happened next. The dust swirled in lazy spirals around the courthouse steps as the auctioneer's gavel struck wood for the third time that morning. October in Cedar Ridge brought with it the smell of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter. But today the air carried something else entirely, the scent of desperation and the weight of judgment. Ezra Lawson stood at the back of the small crowd, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat. At 32, he looked older than his years, the lines around his grey eyes carved deep by too many sleepless nights and too much worry. Beside him, his 7-year-old son Samuel pressed close, the boy's thin frame trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the fever that had been burning through him for 3 days now. "Next item," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the gathering like a funeral bell. "The properties and obligations of Mrs. Judith Merriweather, deceased 2 months past. Outstanding debts total $47. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about Judith Merriweather's debts, just as they knew about the woman who'd inherited them. She stood on the courthouse steps like a statue carved from sorrow, her dark hair pulled back severely, her brown eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. Her black dress was simple but well-mended, and her hands, clasped in front of her, bore the calluses of hard work. "The widow comes with the debt," the auctioneer continued, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were selling livestock. "Customary arrangement. What am I bid?" Ezra felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard of such arrangements in the territories, though he'd hoped civilization had moved past such practices. A woman could be auctioned along with property if she had no means to pay inherited debts, not as property herself, but as an indentured servant until the debt was cleared. $2, someone called from the crowd. Ezra recognized the voice. Marcus Brennan, who owned the largest ranch outside town. Brennan had buried 2 wives already and was known for working his hands to the bone. "3, came another voice, then another. The bidding was slow, reluctant. No one really wanted the burden of a woman's debt, especially not one shrouded in the kind of whispered stories that followed Judith Merriweather's successor. The woman they called the cursed widow had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 months ago, claiming to be Judith's distant niece. She'd kept house for the old woman until Judith's death, and by territorial law, the debts had passed to her. But it was the stories that had taken root. Stories about the strange herbs she grew in Judith's garden, about the way she seemed to know when storms were coming, about the peculiar remedies she'd offered to desperate folks when the town doctor was away. $4, someone bid from the middle of the crowd. $5, Ezra heard himself say, the words leaving his mouth before his mind could catch up. The crowd turned to look at him, and he felt Samuel's small hand grip his coat. The boy was burning up, and Doc Morrison had shaken his head earlier that morning, muttering about nothing more he could do except wait and pray. Ezra didn't have money for prayer, but he had $5 saved from his last job breaking horses for the cavalry, and something in the woman's bearing spoke to him, a dignity that refused to break despite the circumstances. $5 to Mr. Lawson, the auctioneer called. Going once, going twice. The silence stretched, no one else willing to match even that modest bid. The auctioneer's gavel fell with finality. Sold to Mr. Ezra Lawson for $5. The debt and the woman are his responsibility now. The crowd began to disperse, most folks avoiding eye contact with either Ezra or the woman who would now be coming home with him. As people drifted away, he approached her slowly, Samuel clinging to his side like a shadow. She looked up at him then, and he was struck by the clearness of her gaze. No fear there, no gratitude either. Just a calm assessment, as if she were taking his measure the same way he might examine a horse before purchase. I'm Ezra Lawson, he said quietly. This is my son, Samuel. Rebecca Whitmore, she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. I suppose we should discuss the terms of this arrangement. He nodded toward Samuel, who was leaning heavily against his leg now, the fever making him unsteady. My boy's been sick, Doc Morrison says there's nothing more he can do." Rebecca's gaze shifted to the child, and something in her expression changed. She knelt slowly, bringing herself to Samuel's eye level. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward the boy's forehead. Samuel looked up at his father, who nodded. Rebecca's palm was cool against the child's burning skin, and she studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given Ezra moments before. "How long has he been like this?" she asked. 3 days. Started with chills, then the fever came on strong. He's barely keeping water down." Rebecca stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "We should get him home. I have some things that might help." The ride back to Ezra's small homestead was quiet, except for the creak of wagon wheels and Samuel's labored breathing. Rebecca sat in the back of the wagon bed, her hand resting on the boy's forehead, and Ezra found himself stealing glances at her in the late afternoon light. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 26, and despite the harsh circumstances, there was something almost serene about her presence. His cabin sat in a clearing beside a creek that wound down from the mountains, surrounded by cottonwoods that were just beginning to turn gold. It was a simple place, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small barn for his horse and the milk cow. Not much to offer a woman, especially one who'd just had her life auctioned away. "It's not much," he said as he lifted Samuel from the wagon. "It's honest," Rebecca replied, gathering her few possessions, a worn carpet bag and a wooden crate that smelled of herbs and dried flowers. "That's more than most places can claim." Inside, Ezra settled Samuel on the narrow bed in the small back room, while Rebecca examined the cabin's sparse furnishings. She moved with quiet efficiency, taking inventory the way a good housekeeper would, but there was no judgment in her manner. "I'll need to make a tea," she said. "Do you have honey?" "Some. Not much. It will do." She unpacked her crate carefully, revealing dozens of small cloth bags and glass jars filled with dried plants. "The fever needs to break, but gently. Too fast, and it could shock his system." Ezra watched from the doorway as she worked, brewing something that smelled of mint and other herbs he couldn't identify. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before, measuring ingredients by sight and feel, rather than following any written recipe. "You're not from around here," he observed. "Ohio, originally, then Kansas for a while. I came west after—" She paused, stirring the tea with a wooden spoon. "After my husband died. I'm sorry." She glanced up at him, and for a moment, her careful composure slipped. He was a good man, deserved better than what he got. The tea was ready, and she carried it to Samuel's bedside. The boy was barely conscious, but she managed to get him to take small sips, speaking to him in a voice so gentle it might have been a lullaby. "My wife left 2 years ago," Ezra found himself saying. "Took the wagon and what money we had, left Samuel and me to figure things out. Haven't seen her since." Rebecca didn't respond immediately, focused on coaxing more tea into Samuel. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully chosen. "Some people aren't built for this life. It doesn't make them evil necessarily, but it doesn't make their leaving hurt any less." Night fell while they took turns sitting with Samuel, watching for any change in his condition. Ezra dozed fitfully in his chair by the fireplace, starting awake every time the boy stirred or coughed. Around midnight, he heard Rebecca moving quietly in the kitchen, and he found her making another pot of tea. "His fever's not breaking," she said, without looking up. "I need to try something stronger." She returned to her crate and withdrew a small glass bottle filled with dark liquid. "This is made from willow bark and a few other things. It's bitter, but it might help where the gentler remedies haven't." "Will it hurt him?" "Not if I'm careful with the dosage." But Ezra, she turned to face him, and he saw worry lines etched around her eyes. "I need you to understand something. People call me cursed for a reason. The last 3 children I tried to help, they all died. I don't know if it's bad luck or something worse, but you should know what you're risking." He studied her face in the lamplight, seeing past the rumors and whispers to the woman underneath. Someone who'd lost her own husband, who'd carried the weight of other people's grief, who was offering to risk everything to save a child she'd only just met. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "I think your boy is dying, and I think I might be able to help him, but I also think if he dies while under my care, this town will never forgive either of us." Ezra looked toward the back room where Samuel lay burning with fever. 3 days of watching his son slip away, 3 days of feeling helpless, while the only person he had left in the world grew weaker. He thought about his ex-wife, about how she'd looked at their life here like it was a prison, about all the ways a person could abandon the people they were supposed to love. "Do it," he said. Rebecca nodded once, then disappeared into Samuel's room. Ezra heard her voice, low and soothing, as she coaxed the boy to drink the medicine. Then silence, broken only by the wind outside and the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. He must have fallen asleep in his chair, because the next thing he knew, dawn light was streaming through the windows and Rebecca was shaking his shoulder gently. "Ezra," she whispered, "come see." Samuel was sitting up in bed, pale but alert, asking for water in a clear voice. The fever had broken sometime in the early hours of the morning, and though the boy was weak, the dangerous flush had left his cheeks. "Papa?" Samuel said, reaching toward his father with thin arms. "I'm hungry." Ezra gathered his son against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of normal breathing, the cool touch of skin no longer burning with fever. When he looked up, Rebecca was standing in the doorway, with tears streaming silently down her face. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded and turned away, busying herself with packing up her medicines. "I'll make him some broth. He needs to start eating again slowly." If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither Ezra nor Rebecca had expected. She cared for Samuel with the devotion of someone who understood how precious a recovered life could be, coaxing him back to full strength with careful meals and gentle attention. Ezra found himself watching her work, noticing the way she hummed under her breath while cooking, the way she listened to Samuel's chatter about rocks and birds, and all the important things 7-year-old boys discovered in their world. She slept on a makeshift bed by the fireplace, insisting it was proper and comfortable enough. During the day, she tended the small garden behind the cabin with an expertise that surprised him, coaxing late vegetables from the cooling soil, identifying wild plants he'd never noticed, preparing remedies for winter ailments they might encounter. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked one afternoon, watching her dry herbs in carefully arranged bundles. "My grandmother, mostly. She was Cherokee, married a white trader, back when such things were slightly less scandalous than they are now. She taught me about plants, about listening to what the land could tell you." Rebecca's hands moved steadily as she worked, separating leaves from stems with practiced efficiency. "My husband thought it was foolishness until our first winter in Kansas. Then he was grateful enough for the medicines when the fever came through our settlement." "Is that how he died? The fever?" Her hands stilled for a moment. "No, that was later. Raiders came through in the spring, looking for cattle and horses. David tried to reason with them. She resumed her work, but her voice had grown distant. "Some men don't understand reason." Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen enough violence on the frontier to know how such stories ended, and he understood now why Rebecca had looked at Samuel with such fierce protectiveness that first night. "I'm sorry," he said, because there weren't words for the rest of it. "The worst part wasn't losing him," she continued, surprising him with her honesty. "It was what came after. Neighbors who'd been grateful for my help when their children were sick suddenly decided I was dangerous. Started saying maybe I'd brought the raiders somehow, maybe I'd cursed the settlement. Easier to blame the outsider than to accept that sometimes terrible things just happen. Is that why you came to Judith? Judith was my great aunt, the only family I had left. She wrote and said Cedar Ridge needed someone with my skills, especially with Doc Morrison getting on in years. I thought maybe here with family, things would be different. Rebecca's laugh held no humor. Took about 2 weeks for the whispers to start again. When Judith died, I think half the town was convinced I'd hastened her along somehow. Did you? The question hung in the air between them, direct and unavoidable. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. I eased her pain in her final days, made sure she wasn't afraid. But no, Ezra, I didn't kill her. She was 83 years old and tired of living in a body that hurt her constantly. I just made sure she could go peacefully when her time came. He nodded, understanding now why she'd accepted the auction with such dignity. There had been nowhere else for her to go, no other choice but to trust that someone would see past the rumors to the person underneath. October passed into November, and the first snows began dusting the mountains. Samuel grew stronger each day, his laughter returning to fill the cabin with a sound Ezra had feared he might never hear again. The boy took to following Rebecca around like a devoted puppy, asking endless questions about her herbs and listening with rapt attention to her stories about the Cherokee grandmother who taught her so much. She could predict weather 3 days out, Rebecca told him one evening as they sat by the fire. Said the plants would tell her secrets if she knew how to listen. "Can you do that too?" Samuel asked, his eyes wide with the kind of wonder only children could muster. "Sometimes, when I'm paying attention and not too caught up in my own thoughts." Ezra listened from his chair, mending a bridle and trying not to think about how natural this felt. The three of them together in the warm circle of lamplight while winter pressed against the windows. It was dangerous thinking, he knew. Rebecca's arrangement was temporary, lasting only until Judith's debts were paid. Come spring, she'd be free to go wherever she chose, and he had no reason to believe she'd choose to stay with a struggling homesteader and his son in a town that had already decided she was trouble. But when she laughed at Samuel's jokes, or when she caught Ezra's eye across the table during dinner, he found himself hoping anyway. The first real test came in late November, when Marcus Brennan rode up to the cabin with his hat in his hands and desperation written across his weathered face. "Lawson," he said, dismounting slowly, "I need to speak with your woman." Ezra felt his shoulders tense. Brennan was a hard man who'd made it clear he disapproved of the auction outcome, and the casual way he referred to Rebecca as "your woman" set teeth on edge. "What's this about, Marcus?" "It's my youngest, Jake. He's been burning with fever for 2 days, and Doc Morrison says there's nothing he can do. My wife's beside herself, and I—" He swallowed hard, pride warring with fear. "I heard what she did for your boy." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd heard every word, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Brennan," she said evenly. "How old is Jake?" 5. "He's a tough little cuss, but this fever's got him down hard. Won't eat, barely takes water. My wife—" His voice cracked slightly. "She's already lost 2 babies. I don't think she could bear losing Jake too." Rebecca looked at Ezra, and he saw the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to help, that much was clear, but she also remembered her own words about the children who'd died under her care. "I'll come," she said finally. "But I need you to understand something, Mr. Brennan. If Jake doesn't recover, if something goes wrong, the blame will fall on me. Are you prepared for that?" Brennan nodded quickly. "Just please try. Please." The ride to the Brennan ranch took an hour through increasingly heavy snow. Rebecca sat silent in the wagon bed, her medicine box beside her, and Ezra found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in, that this wouldn't end in more heartbreak for any of them. The Brennan house was larger than Ezra's cabin, but felt somehow smaller, weighed down by fear and the smell of sickness. Mrs. Brennan met them at the door, her face streaked with tears, and her eyes holding the hollow look of a woman who'd already grieved too much. "Please," she whispered to Rebecca, "please save my baby." Jake Brennan was smaller than Samuel, a wiry boy with his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's gentle eyes. But those eyes were glazed with fever now, and his breathing came in quick, shallow pants that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. Rebecca worked quietly, efficiently, her hands sure and steady as she prepared medicines and teas. She showed Mrs. Brennan how to help, involving the desperate mother in every step of the process. Ezra and Marcus waited in the main room, listening to the soft murmur of women's voices and the occasional cry from the sick child. "Your woman," Marcus said after a long silence. "She really saved Samuel." "She did. Why'd you bid on her that day? You hardly had 2 coins to rub together. Everyone knew that." Ezra considered the question, watching snowflakes swirl past the window. Something about the way she carried herself, like she'd been beaten down but hadn't broken, reminded me of a Mustang I broke once, spirit intact underneath all the wounds. Marcus nodded slowly. "Heard tell she might be part Indian. Does it matter?" "Might to some folks. Some folks need to mind their own business." They sat in silence after that, 2 fathers united in the terrible weight that came with watching a child balance on the edge between life and death. Around midnight, Rebecca emerged from the sick room, exhaustion written in every line of her body. "The fever's starting to break," she said quietly, "but he's not out of danger yet. The next few hours will tell us which way this goes." Mrs. Brennan appeared behind her, looking haggard but hopeful. "He asked for water," she said, as if this simple request was a miracle worth celebrating. Dawn was breaking when Jake Brennan finally turned the corner. The fever broke completely, his breathing eased, and he managed to keep down some broth Rebecca had prepared. By the time the sun was fully up, it was clear the boy would recover. "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Brennan said, clutching Rebecca's hands. "I don't know what we would have done." "Just get him well," Rebecca replied. "That's thanks enough." The ride home was quiet, both of them exhausted from the long night. But as they pulled into the clearing by Ezra's cabin, he noticed something different in Rebecca's posture. A straightening of her shoulders, a lifting of her chin. "Feels good to help someone and not have them die," she said softly. "Maybe the curse wasn't real after all." She looked at him thoughtfully. Maybe. Or maybe it just took the right place and the right people to break it. Word of Jake Brennan's recovery spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire. By the next Sunday, folks who'd crossed the street to avoid Rebecca were nodding politely when they passed. By Christmas, 3 more families had sought her help with various ailments, and each success seemed to diminish the whispers that had followed her from Kansas. Ezra watched it all with quiet satisfaction, proud of the way she handled each case with the same careful attention she'd shown Samuel and Jake. But he also watched the calendar, knowing that spring would bring decisions none of them had yet voiced aloud. Christmas Eve found them in the cabin with Samuel already asleep, the boy worn out from the excitement of his first real Christmas in 2 years. Ezra had managed to trade work for a few small gifts, and Rebecca had surprised them both by producing a beautifully carved wooden horse she'd somehow found time to make. "It's been a good day," she said, settling into the chair across from him by the fire. "Best we've had in a long while." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind singing through the trees outside. Finally, Rebecca spoke the words they'd both been thinking. "Spring's coming soon." "It is. The debt's nearly paid. Another month or 2 of work and I'll be free to go wherever I choose." Ezra nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "Any ideas where that might be?" She was quiet for so long he wondered if she'd decided not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day, about some people not being built for this life. I used to think I was one of them, too soft for the frontier, too different to fit in anywhere. But watching Samuel grow stronger, helping other children get well, learning to belong somewhere, she looked up at him, and in the firelight, her eyes seemed to hold every star in the winter sky. I think maybe I was wrong. Rebecca, he said carefully, are you saying what I hope you're saying? I'm saying that if you and Samuel would have me, if the arrangement suited everyone involved, I might be persuaded to stay. Not as payment for a debt, but as... She hesitated, searching for the right words. As family, he finished softly. As family. He stood and crossed to her chair, taking her hands in his. They were smaller than he'd expected, but strong from years of work and healing. Nothing would make us happier. Nothing in this world. When he kissed her, it was gentle and hesitant, a question and an answer all at once. She tasted like the mint tea she favored, like hope and new beginnings and all the second chances he'd stopped believing in. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth around the cabin. By April, Rebecca's garden was thriving, and word of her healing skills had spread beyond Cedar Ridge to neighboring settlements. She never charged money for her help, accepting instead trades of food, fabric, or small necessities that kept their household running smoothly. The wedding was set for May, a simple ceremony in the small church with most of the town in attendance. Even Marcus Brennan came, bringing his wife and fully recovered Jake, who'd appointed himself Samuel's best friend and constant companion. Doc Morrison, now officially retired and grateful to have a competent healer to refer patients to, performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure. As Ezra and Rebecca exchanged vows in front of friends who'd once crossed the street to avoid her, he thought about the strange turns life could take, the way hope could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. But it was the final surprise that the town of Cedar Ridge would remember longest, the twist that would turn their story into legend. 3 days after the wedding, as Rebecca was tending her garden in the early morning light, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Margaret Lawson, Ezra's ex-wife, stood beside a worn wagon with her new husband, a man whose soft hands and clean clothes marked him as a city dweller, unused to frontier life. "Ezra," Margaret called, her voice carrying the same imperious tone he remembered too well. "We need to talk." Rebecca straightened slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she used for cutting herbs. Samuel, playing nearby with a collection of smooth river stones, looked up with confusion written across his face. "Margaret," Ezra said, emerging from the cabin. "It's been a while." She looked older, he noticed, and softer around the edges, in a way that suggested an easier life than the one she'd left behind. Her dress was finer than anything she'd owned during their marriage, and her hands bore no calluses from hard work. "I've come for Samuel," she announced without preamble. "Charles and I have established ourselves in San Francisco, and we can provide him with opportunities you never could. Education, culture, a proper future." The words hit like a physical blow. Ezra felt Rebecca step closer to his side, her presence steadying him even as his world threatened to tilt off its axis. "You left him," he said quietly. "You walked away and never looked back." "I was young and foolish," Margaret replied, though her tone suggested she considered herself anything but foolish now. "I made a mistake, but I'm here to correct it. Charles has no children of his own, and we can give Samuel everything he deserves." "Everything he deserves." Rebecca's voice was soft, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "Like a mother who stays when he's sick, like a home where he's wanted just as he is." Margaret's gaze shifted to Rebecca for the first time, taking in the simple dress, the dirt under her fingernails from garden work, the way she stood protectively near Samuel. "And you are?" "I'm his stepmother. I'm the one who's been here." "I see." Margaret's laugh was crystalline and cold. "Well, I'm sure you've done your best, but Samuel needs more than folk remedies and frontier wisdom. He needs real schooling, real opportunities. Samuel had gone very still, his young face pale as he tried to understand the conversation swirling around him. Finally, he spoke in a voice smaller than usual. "Papa, do I have to go?" The question broke something inside Ezra's chest. He knelt beside his son, seeing Margaret's features in the boy's face, but knowing the heart that beat inside him belonged entirely to this place, these people, this life they'd built together. "What do you want, Samuel?" he asked quietly. "If you could choose for yourself, what would you want?" The boy looked from his father to Rebecca, then at the woman who'd given him life but abandoned him when things became difficult. When he spoke, his words were clear and certain. "I want to stay home. I want Rebecca to teach me about plants, and I want to help Papa with the horses, and I want to play with Jake when he visits. I don't want to go to San Francisco." Margaret's face flushed with anger and something that might have been hurt. "He's a child. He doesn't understand what's best for him." "He understands more than you think," Rebecca said quietly, "and he understands who's been here when it mattered. You have no legal claim to him." Margaret snapped. "I'm his mother." "Are you?" Rebecca stepped forward, and suddenly she seemed taller, more formidable than her slight frame suggested. "Because from where I stand, being a mother means more than giving birth. It means sitting up all night when fever burns through their little body. It means celebrating when they take their first steps back to health. It means staying, even when staying is hard." The two women faced each other across the clearing, and Ezra realized he was witnessing something more than just an argument over custody. This was a reckoning between two different kinds of love, one that demanded and took, and one that gave and protected. "I have money now," Margaret said, as if that settled everything. "Charles owns 3 businesses in the city. We can give Samuel advantages you people could never dream of." "Can you give him this?" Rebecca gestured toward the garden, the creek, the mountains rising beyond the clearing. "Can you give him the knowledge of how to heal, how to listen to what the land is telling him, how to find his place in something bigger than profit and propriety?" "I can give him civilization. We gave him life," Ezra said simply. "When he was dying and you were nowhere to be found, Rebecca saved him. Not with money or fancy doctors, but with knowledge passed down through generations, with herbs grown in our own soil, with love that doesn't count the cost." Margaret looked between them, perhaps finally recognizing that she faced not just opposition, but a united front, forged in shared struggle and genuine care. "The law," she began. "The law might say you have a claim," Rebecca interrupted. "But laws change, especially when a community speaks with one voice. And this community has seen who's been caring for Samuel, who's been here when it mattered." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses filled the clearing. Marcus Brennan rode in first, followed by Doc Morrison, then other neighbors. Families whose children Rebecca had helped heal, men who'd worked alongside Ezra, women who'd come to respect the quiet strength of the woman they'd once feared. "Heard there was some kind of trouble out here," Marcus said, dismounting with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Thought we'd come see if you folks needed any help." Margaret looked around the gathering, seeing perhaps for the first time what her ex-husband and his new wife had built here. Not just a marriage, but a place in a community that valued loyalty and service over bloodlines and money. "I could fight this in court," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "You could," Doc Morrison agreed, "but you'd be fighting more than just Ezra and Rebecca. You'd be fighting all of us, and we tend to protect our own." Samuel had remained quiet through most of this exchange, but now he walked over to Margaret with the careful politeness Rebecca had taught him. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I hope you'll be happy in San Francisco. But this is where I belong." Margaret looked down at her son, this boy who'd grown from the toddler she'd left behind into a child with his father's steadiness and his stepmother's gentle wisdom. For a moment, Ezra thought he saw regret flicker across her features, a recognition of everything she'd given up when she'd chosen the easier path. "I see," she said quietly. Then to Charles, who'd remained silent throughout the confrontation, "I think it's time we headed back to town." As her wagon disappeared down the trail, Rebecca sank into Ezra's arms, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. Samuel pressed close to both of them, and the neighbors began to drift away, satisfied that the crisis had passed. "Do you think she'll try again?" Rebecca asked. "No," Ezra said with certainty. "I think she saw what we've built here, and she knows she can't compete with that." The story of Margaret's return and defeat spread through Cedar Ridge and beyond, cementing Rebecca's place in the community's folklore. She'd arrived as the cursed widow, bought at auction for $5, but she'd become something far more valuable. A healer, a mother, a woman who'd helped transform not just one family, but an entire town's understanding of what it meant to belong. Years later, when Samuel was grown and had children of his own, when Rebecca's garden had become famous throughout the territory for its healing herbs, when Ezra's hair had gone white and his hands bore the marks of decades of honest work, people still told the story of the auction that changed everything. They told it as a reminder that sometimes the most precious things in life come disguised as burdens, that love is measured not in dollars, but in devotion, and that the true curse isn't in being different. It's in being too proud to recognize the gifts that difference can bring. Rebecca never forgot the day she'd stood on those courthouse steps, believing herself to be at the end of her story. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything that mattered, a love that grew like her gardens, slowly and surely, tended with patience and faith, until it bloomed into something beautiful enough to last a lifetime. These stories from our channel are entirely fictional and created to inspire and entertain, never intended to offend anyone. If you've enjoyed this tale of love, second chances, and the true meaning of family on the American frontier, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who appreciate stories of hope and redemption. Leave a comment below telling us what touched your heart most about Rebecca and Ezra's journey. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the best things in life come to us when we least expect them, often disguised as challenges that test our capacity for love and courage.